Great. So yeah, hi everyone, and thanks so much for joining us again today. It's great to see some familiar faces from previous sessions that I've ran over the year. My name's Joe. If I haven't met you before, I'm a learning development consultant here at Cornerstone Resources. Today we're going to be talking about something that's coming in from October, which is that unions can get a brand new legal right to request access to workplaces. And for a lot of organisations on this call, that's probably genuinely never something you've had to think about before, perhaps. We'll keep it light, we'll keep it practical, and by the time we're done in about 25 minutes, you'll hopefully have a proper handle on what's coming in. So let me just quickly tell you where we're headed today. So I always think that's quite a helpful thing to do to shape the session before we get into it. So by the time we finish up, from now, you'll have a clear sense of what's actually changing and when it kicks in. You'll be able to recognize a real access request if one ever turns up in your inbox and roughly how long you've got to complete. And you'll walk away with a checklist you can work through this week as well. So rather than just giving you a vague feeling of what to do, I want to give you a checklist you can actually take away, something you can work on with your peers, your team if you need to as well. So just so you know what kind of session this is, today's about understanding what's changing, and making sure you're not caught out, really, the theory and the direction of travel that things are going in. If you ever actually need to handle a request coming in, that's a slightly different skill, and it's something we go into properly in a longer session that we're developing and going to provide as an offering for you. But for now, let's just get you up to speed with what's actually happening. So before we get stuck in, I'd just love to hear where everyone's starting from, because as you know, with these sessions, I tend to ask a few multiple choice questions and just get your thoughts on certain things. So if you just have a look at the four options on screen, where would you place yourself right now? So A, very confident, I know the detail. B, I've heard something, not the detail. C, first I'm hearing unions can do this. And then D, didn't know this was coming at all. Where are you at? Whatever it is, just pop your letter in the chat and I'll just give you a few seconds. So yeah, we can see there's a real mix coming in. That's what I'd expect to see. So that's great. Thanks for sharing that. So wherever you're starting from today, you're exactly where you need to be, and hopefully what I shared today can help you understand what's coming through. So now rather than just talk you through this in an abstract sort of way, I want to bring it to life with someone real. So let me just introduce to you Sam. Sam runs an operations department at a 40-person care and support organization. Sam's been there 8 years, and in that whole time has never once had a union conversation. There's no recognized union at their organization. Nothing's ever landed on their desk, and it's simply never been on their radar. I'll come back to Sam throughout this half an hour a few times because their situation is a really good mirror of what a lot of organizations joining us perhaps on this call today would go through. So just keep this person in mind as we go through. And wherever you sit, whether you're running the whole show yourself or you've got a team around you, Sam's situation is really just a stand-in for whoever in your organization would be the first to see something like this land when it comes to trade unions. So before we go any further, I just want to pause for a moment and get a few words on the table because I think it'll make everything else that I go through land a lot better. If you've never really had much to do with unions before, some of this language can feel like it's assuming a bit of a background knowledge you might not have. So let's just clear that up now rather than you wondering what I'm talking about as we go through. So first of all, trade union, at its simplest form, it's just an organization that represents a groups of workers. Historically, that's been linked to bigger industries, factories, manufacturing, that sort of world. But these days, they're actually pretty much active everywhere. Care, hospitality, churches, small professional services, all of it. Recognized union, this is worth knowing because you'll hear it a fair bit today. It just means an employer has formally agreed that a particular union can negotiate on behalf of staff. And here's the thing, really. Most SMEs, so small to medium sized enterprises and charities, don't have this. So if that's you, you're actually in the majority, not the exception there. Access request, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's simply the union formally asking to come in or to reach your staff digitally. That's the entire thing we'll be talking about today, just to give it its proper name here. And then fourthly, there's the CAC. So this is the Central Arbitration Committee. This only tends to sound a bit official and slightly worrying if you've never heard of it. So, just to put your mind at ease straight away, this is an independent government-backed panel, and it actually only gets involved if you and the union genuinely can't agree between yourselves. So, really, think of it less as some enforcement body waiting to step in and more like a neutral referee there to help if the two of you get stuck, not there to catch you out. So, with this language sorted, I think it's now a good time to talk about why this tends to catch organizations off guard in the first place, even once you know all the right words for it. And just before I proceed, you will see that I typically have that QR code on in the corner of the page. If you do have a question about anything I go through today, do feel free to scan that with a phone and you can leave a question. Just leave your name and your email as well, just so we know to come back to you. We won't come back to you in today's meeting, but we will come back to you afterwards if you do ask a question. So why does something like this topic catch some people like Sam off guard? A few reasons, really. First of all, a lot of organizations like Sam's never simply had to think about unions before. So there's no established way of handling it, nothing to fall back on when something new comes in. On top of that, most places haven't quite settled who'd actually pick this up internally if a request did land tomorrow. And that's a really easy thing to overlook when it's never come up before. And there's also a common assumption floating around that this kind of thing is for bigger, more industrial employers, factories, and that sort of world, as I mentioned. That's generally not the case anymore. As I said, care, hospitality, churches, smaller professional services, they're all just as much in scope as anyone else, which is exactly why what we're going to unpack next. So with all that in mind, here's roughly where we're going to go today. There's three stops I just want to cover. First, we'll look at what's actually changing, separating out what's already happened from what's genuinely new. Then we'll get into what a real access request looks like in practice, the mechanics of it, the timings, so it feels concrete rather than theoretical. And then we'll spend some proper time on getting ready, the sort of gaps that are really easy to miss, plus a checklist you can actually take away from the session. And just to say up front, we're not going to go through the whole code today, the whole code that's come in. It's a fairly long document and most of it won't be relevant for you day to day. So we're just deliberately focusing on the parts that matter most for organizations right now. So let's look at that first stop then, what's actually changing. And it's worth separating out two different things here because they tend to get talked about as one big blur when really they're actually quite distinct. Some of this is actually already in law. So since the Employment Rights Act came in, it's actually got a fair bit easier for a union to become formally recognised than that's the recognised union that I talked about a few slides ago, where an employer agrees a union can negotiate on a staff's behalf. It used to need 40% support across the whole workforce before that could happen, and now it just needs a simple majority of whoever actually votes, so a smaller hurdle to clear there. Protections around industrial action got a bit stronger as well, and all of that already happened and is already settled, so it's genuinely nothing to worry about right now. What's actually new from October then is the right of access itself. So this is the ability for a union to formally ask to come into your workplace or reach your staff digitally. And that applies or not you've got a recognized union there already or not. So really it's worth putting your energy into understanding that new bit properly. And that is the biggest change coming in and what's going to impact people the most. So what does that new right actually let a union do? It gives them the ability to meet, support, represent, and recruit workers, and that's whether those workers are already union members or not. It also lets them work towards something called collective bargaining, which just means a union negotiating pay, hours, or working conditions on behalf of a group of staff rather than each person negotiating for themselves. That's a much longer process on its own, though. It's not something one access request would get you in a single go. It's more of a longer road that access might eventually lead towards. And it's worth knowing it doesn't cover organising industrial action at all. That's ruled out completely, which tends to put people's minds at ease a bit once they hear that. So, and fourthly, actually, which is really important, is the number that really matters here is 21 workers. And that's the threshold for being in scope as well. And it's counted across your whole organization. So it might mean that you're not in this scope, but it might mean you are if you did count everybody up. So it's not just talking about one site, it would consider the whole organization. So even a small branch of a bigger charity or business can be still well within scope, which is worth bearing in mind before you assume that this doesn't apply to you. So now I think it's only fair if I'm upfront about what we actually know for certain versus what could still shift a little, because not everything is certain. The threshold, the timescales, the request template itself, all of that's laid out properly in the draft code of practice, which you can find online. That's currently sitting with Parliament. Some of the very finest detail could still move a touch before it's fully signed off. But the overall direction is settled and this is happening. It's not a maybe, which is why we're talking about it today. So treat everything I'm sharing today as reliable enough to plan around. Just hold the very specific numbers a little loosely until it's officially confirmed. Right now, then, what we've covered is what's changing and who it applies to. Let's just move on to that second stop now, which is three ways access can actually happen. So first of all, sometimes it's voluntary. You and the union simply agree it between yourselves without needing to go through any formal process at all. And that's honestly the easiest and smoothest route if you can get there. Sometimes it's a negotiated statutory agreement where you go through the formal steps but still land on the terms together as two parties, talking it through. And then thirdly, sometimes if there's generally if things generally can't be resolved between the two parties, the Central Arbitration Committee steps in and then decides the terms for you. So this is the sort of the last resort, if you like. It's worth knowing that voluntary agreement really is the preferred route here. The whole system is built to encourage you and the union to work it out together rather than escalating things unnecessarily. But there is that backstop, if you like, where if people can't agree, the CAC may come in. So once a request lands, there's a bit of a process that follows, and it's worth knowing roughly how that would work. So the employer has 15 working days to respond. Then there's a 25 working day window where you and the union talk through the actual terms together. The room, the frequency, that sort of thing. Most of the time, that's where it ends. You reach an agreement and get on with it. It's only if you can't agree that it goes to that Central Arbitration Committee, as I mentioned, the CAC, and they'll sort of step in and decide the terms for you instead. So think of that CAC as a bit like a mediator that they might step in, that might step in other situations. And just so the full picture's there, if an agreement is already in place and one side genuinely isn't sticking to it, say access was agreed monthly and the employer just stops responding, that's what we call a breach. And there's a formal process for the union to raise that too. So it's not something that happens by accident or from a bit of a slow reply. That's not what I talk about when I talk about a breach. It's specifically about an agreed arrangement not being honoured. So really the main thing to take from all this is that there's more time built in than people expect and a clear, fairly gentle process to follow if you're ever unsure. So now you know the timeline. Let's make this properly concrete and look at what one of these requests actually contains when it lands. So it'll usually tell you who's asking and which union it is, which workers they're hoping to reach, whether they're after a physical access, digital access like email or your internal messaging system, whatever that might be, or a mix of both, and how often they'd like that to happen as well, along with what they'd need from you to make it work. So a room, a call link, what sort of practical thing they might need. And if there happens to be a small mistake somewhere in the request, that's generally not meant to be a reason to reject it outright. The whole idea is that you work through it together rather than treating it as a technicality. So this should be a teamwork thing. You should be working together in this situation. So now I'd just like to bring Sam back in for a moment, just to again make this practical for you. So a request has just landed in Sam's inbox. I want you to genuinely put yourself in their shoes here, because none of these options on screen right now are actually unreasonable. So I'd just like to ask you, would you reply within a day or two just to show willing and get ahead of it if a request came in? Would you loop in your own manager and wait for their steer before doing anything? Would you C, read it properly against the 15-day window before deciding anything? Or D, call the union rep directly to ask what they're actually looking for? What would you go for? No right or wrong answer. As I've said, all of these could actually be sensible in some way. It'd just be great to hear what you think you would do. Great. So I can see a mix. I can see some A's coming through. So I can see some replying within a day or two to show willing and get ahead of it. I can see some read it properly against the 15-day window. Brilliant. So there's an interesting spread there, and honestly, I'd expect that. They're all fairly sensible instincts, as I mentioned. So here's why reading it properly first would tend to win out of those four options. Like I said, they're all okay, but there's probably one that would stand out to me, even though the others aren't bad instincts at all. Replying really quickly can feel proactive, but if you commit to something in writing before you've actually understood what's being asked, that's quite hard to walk back from later. If you're waiting for a manager's steering, it's sensible in a lot of situations, but remember there's a 15-day window here. There's no need to pause everything while you wait for someone else's availability. And calling the union rep directly isn't wrong exactly as well. So that was option D, but it does skip a step. You're much better placed to have that conversation once you actually know what the request covers. So reading it properly first doesn't close any doors, just means whatever Sam does next in this situation, whether it's reply, escalate, or pick up the phone, they're doing it from a position of actually understanding what's in front of them. So that's why I would always encourage this option. You can see a question just come in on whether it's 15 calendar days or 15 working days. I will clarify that in my follow-up email actually, because it's a really good question, because it's obviously a very different answer. So I'll come back to you on that one in the follow-up email that I send afterwards. Thanks for that question. So that's the mechanics covered, which brings us nicely to our third and final stop, which is getting ready. And when it comes to readiness, there are a few things that quietly slip through the cracks for a lot of organizations. And I just want to be clear, this is really common rather than unusual, so no need to feel caught out by any of this. Often nobody's specifically being told that they're a contact point for this situation, so it's worth having a quick think about whether a request today would actually reach the right person that it needs to in a quick manner, or would it sit in a shared inbox for a while before anyone noticed. It's also common not to have a clear sense of who'd actually sign off a response. So this is why it's so important to have these things in place for people to know who's doing what. And for whoever's likely to be approached first, who is that person, whether that's you directly or someone in your team, not to realize that saying no on the spot isn't really an option. A quick informal refusal in the moment can end up causing more difficulty than just taking a breath and following the proper process as we've just talked about. There's a nice little detail worth knowing too. If a meeting does happen, you or a colleague aren't actually able to sit in on it unless the union specifically invites you along. So that's actually something that a lot of people won't know, but it's worth knowing that none of this tends to be obvious until a request actually turns up, which is exactly why it's worth having a think about this, becoming aware of it now while there's no pressure on at all. So now for the bit that you'd like to take away, I imagine. So given everything we've just talked through, here's the real practical bit that I think will be helpful for you beyond the session. So it's worth you confirming you're actually in scope. So are you in scope, 21 workers or more across your wider organization rather than just the one site you might be thinking of? Having one clear person as the lead contact, as I just mentioned on the last slide, makes a real difference too, rather than it being a bit unclear who'd pick things up if something did land. It's also worth having an honest think about whether your current employee relations processes would hold up if a union started asking detailed questions about how you handle things like grievances or consultation. And making sure whoever's likely to be approached first knows they don't need to respond to anything on the spot. That matters just as much as everything else we just talked about, whether that's you, a manager, or anyone else who might end up fielding it. And that's a process to lean on instead of reacting in the moment. So building on that checklist, being properly ready for this really does come down to a few good habits that should be in place rather than anything complicated. So when something lands, take a moment to check the timeline rather than reacting straight away in the heat of it. Internally, have one person who clearly owns it. It's a lot less stressful than it becoming a scramble. And then more broadly, it's worth putting those basics in place now, whether while there's no pressure, rather than trying to build it all from scratch when there is pressure on. And then just one thing really to might be genuinely reassuring for some people on the call if this does apply to you. For example, if you're in a care or a church setting specifically, full DBS check isn't usually needed for a visiting union official unless they'd actually be in contact with children or vulnerable adults. So it's worth not overcomplicating that part unnecessarily unless it needs to be done. So with all of that covered, if there's just one thing I want you to take away, so I always try and give you one thing to take away beyond the session at least. have a quick think about who in your organization would actually know if a request landed. Who do you want that person to be? If you're not sure of the answer straight away, that's honestly a great place to start out of everything I've spoke about today. And if it helps have a bit more support of putting any of this into practice, this is how we at Cornerstone can help. We can work you through your policies or work through your policies with you and your processes so that they generally would hold up if tested. There's also our Lead with Confidence program for managers, which covers a lot of the themes we've talked about today in when it comes to the skills. And if you like some ongoing support as things develop, we can also obviously be your HR backup, as I mentioned in previous sessions. Particularly if some of this finer detail is still being finalised with Parliament, we're very happy to be there for that role as well. And finally, just so as I mentioned, today was a very quick whistle-stop tour into the theory of what's changing, but I also want to flag something separately because today's very much been that. But the idea of actually carrying out this process is quite practical and skill-based. So if a request actually lands on your desk one day, working through it in practice is its own skill. And it's honestly a bit different depending on where you sit in your organization as well. So I will be putting together a 2 hour session that goes properly practical into that. If you're an owner or a leader, it looks at what's actually reasonable to agree to, what should give you pause, what a request could genuinely cost you if it's handled badly, including a proper look at the CAC and what a breach means in practice. So you're making an informed decision really rather than a guess. So if you're in a management or HR role, this could also be for you. It's much more hands-on, how to respond well, what to say, what not to say if someone approaches you directly, and how to manage things once access is actually up and running. And either way, it covers what needs to exist in your organization as a bit of what we've talked about today, but we'll really focus on the practicality of that so that you do feel prepared if this was to ever land in your inbox. I haven't actually locked in a date yet for this, so there's generally nothing to commit to right now, but I will send a follow-up email after the session with a quick voting button on it. And if you're interested in this, please just vote yes. If you're not, you can vote no. And then I'll come back to you with the details of the dates and more information once we do have it. It will be happening this year. It's just not something that's locked in yet, but I wanted to put this on your radar. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. I know it was a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully you enjoyed it. You've been able to take away some things from today. I will send the slides through as well as the recording, which will be on Monday now. I'll also answer that question that came through in the chat as well, and any other questions that were on Mentimeter too. So thanks everyone. Great to see you all again and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.